Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the CWC Coalition's webinar on key issues ahead of the 28th Conference of States Parties of the CWC. My name is Mina Rozei. I am the project coordinator for the CWC Coalition. So today's webinar will be focusing on the important issues that we are facing presently and in the future regarding the CWC. Before we start, I just want to reiterate for those of you who will be attending the conference in The Hague from November 27th to December 1st, the deadlines, important deadlines coming up to register your side event is today. And to register as an individual attendee is November 20th. So I'll put the link to the OPCW website in the chat in just a minute, so you can easily access that if you haven't already. But without further ado, so today we are going to be joined by two of our incredible CWC Coalition members who generously gave some of their time at this busy time of year to prepare presentations and discuss with us. First, we will hear from Richard Guthrie, CBW Events Coordinator, on a few future and current challenges, sustainability, and new opportunities with regards to civil society and the CWC. And then we will be joined by Alex Ghionis, Research Fellow in Chemical and Biological Security at the Harvard Sussex program, regarding 3 ways that the OPCW can take positive steps and build on its current achievements. And then finally, we will have a 30-minute discussion. Q&A, you can put your questions in the Q&A function. The chat will be disabled. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them and ask the questions for you. And then finally, at the end, we will hear a few words from the CWC Coalition Chair, Paul Walker. So without further ado, we will now hear from Richard Guthrie. So Richard, whenever you're ready.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for the invite here. It's a pleasure to be contributing. Apology, I'm not as normally as well dressed. I'm doing some archive work this week, and so hence the scruffiness. Before saying much, I'd just like to, just for clarity, say I speak as an individual. I'm a member of the OPCW's Advisory Board on Education and Outreach, to which we're all appointed as individuals. But what I am saying is in my own personal capacity. I'd like to start by just talking about the general role of civil society in relation to the CWC, and then touch upon 4 themes. The first thing when trying to understand the role of civil society, I think it's really important to note, is that the CWC is often assumed to be a treaty between governments, and it's not. It's a treaty between states parties. And that is important because it requires responses across the whole of each state, not just from the governmental offices. To me, this is a key understanding of the role of the importance of the role of civil society. And we also need to recognise the broad diversity of civil society perspectives in this field, and to be proud that there is a considerable common ground of advocacy for the global regime and for its universality. But I'd just like to touch upon a range of things that civil society does and how some relates to current events. I mean, on a national basis, clearly there is a role for political pressure for national good governance. There's a sort of creation of expectations of what should be done to be a party acting in good standing in the CWC. And that involves things such as enhancing national implementation and ensuring that within a governmental system, adequate resources are provided. You know, governments often have incredibly short-term perspectives. That's the nature of democracy. They're all thinking towards the next election, and yet that longer term pressure to keep efforts such as the CWC going on are very difficult to bring political attention to and political importance to without making them politicize themselves. But on the flip side, there has to be challenges to inadequate governance and inadequate resourcing, which civil society can be tremendously important on. And we also need to, within civil society, be capable of pressing for responding to past injustices. There are many people who have suffered through the years from the processes of manufacturing and researching chemical weapons and in using them. And there are a lot of issues around those injustices. Although we are talking about CSP 28, I would say there is much more to civil society interaction than just the CSPs. And it's really important. As a whole, civil society is constantly producing publications, constantly engaging with relevant authorities, and doing education activities. And I don't want to assume that the themes I identify, which can only be a selection, are everything. I'm really interested in hearing from other civil society participants during the Q&A what are the issues they are concerned about. So in this presentation, I'll give a broad brush approach to 4 themes. I'll briefly outline them with 2 frames of reference. The first being the role of civil society, and the second is any changes from or since the 5th Review Conference that could lead into CSP 28, and so what might be issues at CSP 28. So the first is the current challenges to achieving a chemical weapon-free world. Clearly, Syria is the biggest issue in this case. 10 years without resolution of the Syria situation. And there are wider political divergences that have occurred because of the Syria process. And these have significant implications not only for discussion with informal meetings and the potential for voting with informal meetings for things such as budgets, but also the implications for other engagement, where sometimes long-term thinking can be drowned out by short-term political concerns. A second one within the current challenges is the role of other agents. Things like riot control agents. There has been an informal allegation of use that Russia has been using riot control agents in military activity in Ukraine. This is prohibited under the CWC, but the question of whether this will be acted upon as an allegation is tied up with a number of other political issues. And there are other sort of boundary issues about what is a chemical weapon, what are the correct uses of certain things. So the aerosolized central nervous system acting chemicals that were voted on a CSP or 2 ago are significant. In terms of the current political context, the issue of white phosphorus has been gaining quite a lot of media attention. It's historically, white phosphorus has been seen as an incendiary weapon, not a chemical weapon. But as we look back on some of these things with modern perspectives, there are some who view this material as being closer to a chemical weapon. And there is no consensus on this. This will be important in the future. The second element is sustainability. The difficulty of any international organization is getting sufficient funds. The budget system has changed. We now have a 2-year cycle, the biennial budget, and we're now coming up to the first year of the second cycle of this 2-year process. Now, there have been significant inflationary pressures in the last couple of years, cost of living crisis in many countries. And so there was a big request initially put in for a budget increase merely to keep the purchasing power of the OPCW as it was. This has been pushed back against, and the budget going towards the CSP for a vote is still a matter of contention and not as high as some people had requested. But to me, it's quite interesting that the first year of biennial budget cycle is probably the best time for civil society to be pressing within national context as well as international context on the budget, whereas the second year isn't. And I mean, perhaps within civil society, we need to think about whether we coordinate any activities on that. And then the last quick points on sustainability issues are just the capacities of individuals therefore within national authorities, and the issues around tenure and the gender and geographical spread. But I think Alex Ghionis will be talking a bit more of some of those. And then the final sustainability element is the importance of ensuring that peaceful uses and the protection measures are continued. But I'll come back to that with the Chemtech Centre discussions at the end. So the third of my fourth themes is new challenges. Well, clearly, there is a changing political context. There is this huge geopolitical challenge where arguments exist that lead to huge divergences of opinion. There's not much that individual civil society groups can do with this, other than in the countries that are potentially parties to those, but there is a role for the sort of shaping of the expectations of policy that is important. There's the changing science and technology context, where new possibilities like new developments at central nervous system acting chemicals, and this requires a risk to be balanced against benefits. And one of the areas where I feel civil society could actually work better is reading through and interacting with the results of the Scientific Advisory Board, because quite often for a number of governments, they take a lead from what issues are reflected in those. And the last of the new challenges is chemical forensics, the issues around how you can prove whether, say, an attack has happened. And lastly, new opportunities. And as I say, I mean, there are gaps in all of these things that I've said because I can't deal with all issues. But the new opportunities to me are, firstly, that the last declared chemical weapons have been destroyed. I mean, we are truly moving towards a chemical weapon-free world. But we have an opportunity to engage with new people relating to that, but we also need to promote an understanding of the difference between declared and undeclared chemical weapons. I think this has been a particular difficulty in relation to what has happened after the destruction of the last US chemicals, but the suspicion, belief that there are undeclared materials within Syria is that a fear that some of the people hearing statements might not get the distinction between declared and undeclared. Another new opportunity is the provision of new educational materials within the advisory board. There's been promotion of new educational modules, which should be published soon. The OPCW now has a learning page at learn.opcw.org, and when the new educational modules, which cover a broad set of subject matter within the CWC, are available, they will appear at learn.opcw.org. And then the final new opportunity is the opening of the Chemtech Centre. This will allow new opportunities for new forms of engagement, not only for promoting peaceful uses, but also to sensitize governments to issues of chemistry. And this will be significant, but it will itself have a sustainability problem, because it's not clear how easy it will be for long-term funding to come out of the general assessed budget to support it, and may require voluntary contributions. So with that broad overview, I hand back to Mina, and I'd be very pleased to take any questions and hopefully provide answers. Thank you very much.
That was very informative. next we have Alex. Go ahead.
Thank you to Paul and Mina for giving me the opportunity to speak today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've watched, of course, a number of CWC webinars in the past, and they're excellent ways to bring us all together. So it's a privilege to be asked to directly contribute to one myself. I thought I would provide some comments about the context we are in, sort of following RC5. And then I'll talk around 3 thematic topics to give us a broad sense of some areas that I feel will be quite interesting to follow. So in terms of the context, I guess we're in quite an interesting period because 6 months since the review conference, and I don't think anybody seriously thought we would achieve a substantive consensus outcome document. And if we did, it would likely have been sort of watered down one way, with some minor exceptions perhaps. So in my mind at the time, we were in a sort of catch-22 position. Everyone wants a consensus outcome, but if the consensus outcome is potentially a debilitating one for the OPCW, then what do we do? And indeed, it's a strange feature that now 2 review conferences have not produced a consensus outcome document. You know, not since 2013 have we seen one. So there was a pressure to get a consensus, but you know, at what cost was the question. Now, I feel that the review conference's preparatory process was actually pretty positive, and the pools of common ground were in the making. And this, of course, did not translate into a consensus outcome, but I don't think we should get too hung up on this. These pools of common ground, they don't simply evaporate after the review conference. Indeed, a number of state parties suggested in their various statements that moving forward on specific issues should be the focus, with efforts to take relevant decisions through the Executive Council and the CSP. And indeed, after RC5, the Secretariat continued working, and states parties continued to develop positions and seek to create decisions in the PMOs. A second context is really, I suppose, a much bigger one. Routine stockpile destruction is over for the time being, and routine destruction of old and abandoned weapons will sort of plod on in the background. And there has been, really for quite a long time, talk of moving from the era of destruction to the era of prevention of reemergence or of non-acquisition, you know, whichever you want to call it. And the review conference, whether it was a success or not, represents, to me anyway, a doorway that has now been opened. The transition, or as we might think of it, as sort of functional rebalancing of what the convention is being implemented to do, is really now underway, and the door is open, and I think states parties really must start to walk through it. So for me, the context we're in has these 2 elements. We have the context of the transition and the adaptation, and second, we have pools of common ground on issues which did emerge through the review conference, and I think which still exist today. So the context then requires action-oriented work, new ideas, new approaches, and I think a new energy as well, to be successful within this context. And CSP 28 is really our first opportunity to see how some of these ideas are carried over and carried forward. So in terms of the issues themselves, I wanted to mention 3 thematic areas really, which may find some form at the CSP. The first is really about advancing interconnected, needs-based and impact-driven capacity building. So capacity building is quite a broad umbrella for numerous activities that the Secretariat can support and undertake themselves to improve a whole range of elements of convention implementation. And really, without looking at any one particular type of capacity building, I think there's a couple of aspects that we may see more emphasis, or hopefully we could see more emphasis being placed on. And the first, I think, is what we might call the administration of capacity building. And this is the efforts to increase the thematic interconnection of different activities and a continued focus on really seeking impact-oriented outcomes. And this requires, to quite a great extent, more emphasis on interdivisional project planning and implementation. So that's really about what goes on inside the Secretariat. But it would also benefit from increased needs assessment to deliver capacity building projects on things that are really needed, because one size obviously doesn't fit all. And this requires good dialogue between states parties and the Secretariat. And I think part of this is also about regionalism. And I'd be interested to see options for creating partner projects to the Africa programme, for example, for GRULAC, or even sub-regional ones. And I think now is the time to start to build these new focal projects. Part of this is also about the Chemtech Centre. So I don't want to repeat too much of what Richard said, but in my mind, there has been quite a lot of hype about the Chemtech Centre, and a lot of states parties talk about it in different ways and imagine it for different purposes. But now is the time to move past those blueprints and develop a sort of central vision and strategy and get funding in place for the people and equipment that are necessary. And I do agree that it can serve as a hub for lots of different issues and provide many different services, but it needs to be spooled up incrementally and in concrete terms. And I really would like to see at this CSP some kind of serious discussion about the practicalities here and who will be in charge of the centre, what staff are required, what the projects are, who funds it, what are the operational goals. And I think this is really the start of actually the hardest part of the Chemtech's story, really getting this off the ground. I think an important element in all of this is also about how we ensure that those states parties who've been less engaged in the work of the OPCW are shown the value of the convention. And I think this is especially relevant for those with no destruction obligations or really not much industry to verify. The OPCW needs to broaden its narrative now to develop new stories, to engage new audiences, to demonstrate new reasons for engagement. And I hope that this filters into the discussions around capacity building. And I know that some states were reflecting on precisely this need during the preparatory process for RC5. And I really believe civil society has a role to play in this. The second area I just wanted to talk about, sort of broad thematic areas, embracing change for organizational governance. And of course, good organizational governance is key for the OPCW to effectively deliver on its mandate in this transitional period and into the future. In particular, there was questions around expertise retention, knowledge management and skills management, and equitable geographic representation and gender diversity. And I'll just mention two here in practical terms for the CSP. I mean, the tenure policy is really at the sharp end of this discussion, with a number of states, including the EU, calling for a review and potential adaptation of the tenure policy from at least 2016 in some cases. And there has been a growing interest in that process. So at EC 103, there was a facilitation on tenure policy established with New Zealand and Panama as co-facilitators. And we hope at CSP 28 that they'll be, well, there's an expectation they'll be providing some recommendations. And equally at EC 103, there was the working group on geographical representation, which was established, chaired by Chile. And again, we expect an action plan and conclusions to be delivered at CSP 28 too. But from the outside, really, it is quite early and hard to see what the outcomes of these will be. But I doubt there will be any real overhaul of the current system. Perhaps there will be more formal options presented for pursuing adjustments in an incremental fashion. However, it's important to recall that these issues have been alive for really quite a number of years and represent more than just what their title suggests. These issues underpin, yes, organizational efficiency and effectiveness, and they speak to people and service delivery and quality outcomes, but they also speak to state interests. So these are quite complex matters, and I think if states have approached this as a zero-sum game, then we may be quite underwhelmed by the outcomes. If states have seen quite broad value, then perhaps there is some room for optimism. And the third and final thematic area was really about fostering inclusivity and connectivity. And it's really about how the OPCW connects with those outside of its walls. How it engages with civil society is a really key one that has really captured a lot of our minds. But before I mention that, I just want to consider how verification is also flagging the need to engage. And I don't want to focus on the technical question of verification too much, because others can speak with far greater expertise on this than I can. However, it is apparent to us all that a great number of states parties have reflected on if and how the verification regime could evolve. And, really in the most overly simplified language, there are those who believe it should remain as it is. So static to the letter, serving a discrete and predetermined purpose. And some of those voices are also the same ones who tend not to pay too much attention to questions of implementing the general purpose criterion. Others, of course, recognize industry is constantly changing and consider that the CWC is actually an adaptable treaty. It's primed to keep abreast of S&T, of science and technology, and therefore changes to aspects of verification are perhaps natural and required. But inherent in all of this is the need for relationships with industry to be deepened. Any such changes or adaptations really, to a large extent, need input, feedback, and the acquiescence of industry. I would also add that the future of verification is, to some extent, going to face some of the same challenges that face those working on verification for the BWC, so for the Biological Weapons Convention. And it will be interesting and useful for us in the CW field, and specifically in the OPCW, to listen to what is happening in Geneva at the moment, which I think is an interesting take, because for many years, it's been the other way around, with the BW people sort of often looking at CWC verification regime for inspiration. But it has become apparent, I think, to many of us that the threats and risks of chemical weapons are no longer confined, in the majority, to those threats and risks which are sought to be mitigated through the industrial verification regime as it's currently implemented. And if the BW community are struggling to capture how they verify, I fear that the CW community is perhaps heading in the same direction. Advances in S&T mean that the threat from chemical weapons no longer necessarily come from the places that our verification regime is spending most of its time looking. So how the OPCW engages with us, with industry, with the scientific community, and what it is that we can input, I think deserves some attention. So then finally, I'll touch on engagement with civil society, because it's clearly an important issue. And states parties established at EC 104 a facilitation process chaired by Ecuador and Germany, which will consider the issue of accreditation, but also much wider themes as well inherent in this. As part of this, I received some funding to write a short paper to submit to this facilitation process, really providing some basic analysis on accreditation and participation numbers, and sort of outlining some of the immediate themes and issues that might need to be addressed. The paper hasn't been published yet, but I believe a lunchtime side event at the Australian residence, potentially on Wednesday, 29th of November, will allow us to present some work undertaken by states, but also give me an opportunity to discuss the paper, and I can circulate and discuss that once it's been submitted. But to write the paper, I spoke to a number of individuals in the OPCW and in civil society on an informal basis to really try to understand some of the elements that can be put forward as part of this discussion. So in closing, I really wanted to just note three key aspects which we can share. And the first is that civil society is not one thing. There are a good range of organizational types, and the work done by civil society focuses on really a range of things. And work by the Stimson Center, I think, at the moment to capture this is really useful. There's a need now to think how we better structure civil society to allow this various expertise to be leveraged. Basically, how do we get civil society more broadly and individually to generate projects and work that can directly correspond to OPCW priorities, areas of activity? What are we doing aside from turning up to the CSP that has value, and how do we communicate this? It's difficult, but our work during the intercessional periods is perhaps what is most important for inputting our views to shape how the CWC is implemented. And I think Richard kind of alluded to that in his talk. The second theme of the three is that there's also a geographic imbalance within our own community, with GRULAC, Eastern Europe and Africa being underrepresented over the years. I think we should seek to address this, as really the more voices we can bring into our work, the better. And the more we can offer towards improving implementation of the convention, the better, especially as we move into a prevention of re-emergence era, which requires a much broader and a wider set of communities of knowledge and expertise. And finally, well, the work of the CWCC from 2009, and then the establishment of the NGO coordinator from 2013, has really transformed how we engage with the OPCW. I know Paul has obviously led both from the front and created numerous opportunities and outcomes that were really simply impossible before this. And a question that has been emerging is, what does the future of that institutional arrangement look like? And how do we co-create the what next over the next 10, 15 years? And of course, I don't have an answer for that, but it's on the minds of people inside and outside the OPCW. So as such, a parallel civil society facilitation process over the next year or couple of years may be useful to understand who we are, what we want, what we can offer. And this can draw on surveys, dialogues, workshops, but really to consider what may be required to build on what Paul has forged and produce something which is really sustainable and practical over the much longer term. We're very aware of the sort of politicization of this. So how do we continue to build something sustainable that's protected from the changing winds of state party whims? So really thoughts and ideas on how we do that is really important moving forward. So really in closing, yeah, I think I just want to echo what Richard said, because I'm actually really interested to hear how others in civil society view the situation right now. And moreover, sort of what you and different organizations are actually planning to do to sort of seize the opportunities which are coming to us as we move off from the review conference. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very interested also exploring with everyone how we can cooperate, collaborate, and work together, and indeed, perhaps most importantly, raise the money to do so. You know, as an academic in this field, I need funding to continue this work, and I'm sure many of you do too. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Mina, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. All right, so we are doing well on time. We have about 20-25 minutes or so for answering questions and a discussion. So we did receive a few questions already. I will read it out, and then either between Richard and Alex, whoever would like to answer, that's up to you. So the first question that we have says, I believe you said that the issue of Syrian use of chemical weapons against their own people is illegal, but the issue has not been resolved for 10 years. What has taken so long? So this sort of goes back to the issue of compliance, which has been an outstanding challenge. So if anyone, for Paul as well, anyone would like to take that one?
I'd be happy to take it if you're happy, Mina. Yes, and there've been I mean, I might slightly group some of the questions that are in there together. Yes, I don't think I specifically said illegal. I think, I mean, which I do believe it, but the situation has been unresolved, and there are a range of issues. Some of which are really important to understand the sustainability and longevity of the regime in coming decades. The first is it's very clear that there is very good evidence of additional capacities that the Syrian government has not declared. And so the OPCW has a declaration assessment team that is interacting with Syria. It makes little bits of progress in fits and starts because the Syrians try and block it. And I'm afraid I can't give you an up-to-date reporting on what's happening with that. But there is a set of issues there that, had Syria, say, been an isolated individual country, there would be a much greater chance that the situation would have been resolved by now. What has happened is that Syria has a number of allies. The most significant politically, of course, is Russia. And so the issues have become quite difficult. And we have a number of other problems around that about understanding verification, understanding what is the level of evidence that people would constitute proof. And of course, that becomes very politically charged. Not to digress, but just to sort of highlight that in investigations in Iraq, in Syria, there's been a lot of pushback. Especially people questioning the process of investigation of Duma, attack in Duma in 2018. One of the things that Alex mentioned was the OPCW as a large organization. And one of the difficulties for people outside trying to analyze the OPCW in terms of investigations in Iraq was not simply whether there were questions of political decisions, but just simply the challenges of operating a large organization. Anybody who's worked in a large organization will know experiences where one level of management doesn't always talk to another, one department in its silo doesn't talk to another, and a number of difficulties of investigation in Syria I would put down simply to the general organizational problems that large organizations have. But the difficulty is it's been very difficult to resolve Syria. And as a final point on this, because I think Alex also wants to respond, is the recognition that the CWC is a creature of its time. It was, all international instruments embody the concerns that were in place at the time of the negotiators. That was what they had in their heads. And when the CWC was negotiated, the assumption of CW use was widespread battlefield activity, such as during the Iran-Iraq war. And so the verification tools for investigating alleged use were not so much appropriate. So one of the other questions in the Q&A was about whether challenge inspections had been carried out. And in fact, no challenge inspection has been carried out because it's the political threshold to do so has ended up being much higher, which is why there were other arrangements looking for the investigation of Syria. And I shall hand back to you now, Mina.
Alex, did you want to respond to that as well?
Not really a sort of direct answer, but I do have a slight concern, which speaks to, I think, some of these questions. A concern about how we prevent what some people have termed the sort of Syria fatigue from creeping in, and how do we ensure that the majority of states parties keep up the pressure on Syria and indeed the Russian Federation to resolve inaccuracies, to answer questions, and to return to compliance, in simple terms. And this is really a huge question, but I do have some concern that this focus will begin to disengage some states parties, maybe states parties who haven't been necessarily hugely engaged anyway. And we really can't allow that to happen. I think we need to find a broad or maintain a broad regional base of states pushing for these issues. So it's important to sort of find ways to strengthen that non-use norm. And I don't obviously have the answers of how to do that, but there is a concern, I think, about this engagement and disengagement. After so many years of talking about declaration assessment team, Syria being intransigent on this, Russia sort of ignoring questions. We need to find a way through this, which doesn't let people and states off the hook.
Thank you. All right. So the next question we have, how do we improve national implementation, which sits at about 50 to 75%? Can we partner national authorities or some other arrangement to encourage and improve annual declaration?
Yes, I mean, one of the great challenges of the CWC was that within the process of negotiating it, there was a recognition that parts of implementation had to be done at a national level and parts by the international organization. And as the negotiations continued, there was a realization that the more activities that could be put at a national level made the multilateral structure cheaper. But what that requires is for national implementation to be carried out effectively. And one of my concerns is, or while I have a concern about the countries that haven't introduced implementing legislation, which is a concern, there are also many other countries that do have legislation in place, but not sustainable methods for carrying out enforcement and monitoring of their CWC obligations. And there's a very human factor here as well. I mean, one of the projects I'm quietly working on is about how to enhance national authorities. Most national authorities are under-resourced, but of course, within large organizations like trade ministries, foreign ministries, defense ministries, or environment ministries, which is broadly where national authorities are based, is, always the desk officers are saying there is too much work in all subject areas. And I think one of the things that we are missing is an ability to provide good rationale for people at a national basis to say they require more resources. Because without effective national implementation and national monitoring, there is this tremendous difficulty of you then don't have accurate international methods. And of course, for a global treaty, any abuse, potentially by states, but certainly by non-state actors, will be through whatever is perceived as the weakest link. And so there's an importance for that. And I think part of the difficulty is again, this question of political attention without being a political controversy. There is when governments, the natural process of governments always is to try and not spend money. And I think unless, while chemical weapons are seen by around many countries as an issue that's been resolved, they won't want to invest in their national authorities. And so we have to gently impress upon them that this is part of being a good government, is the well-funded or appropriately funded national authorities and capable national implementation. Thank you.
I also think it's about thinking about these questions slightly more broadly about what we mean by implementation, and indeed what Richard said at the very start of his intervention about, this is a treaty for states and all the apparatus which comes with the state. It's not just about the government. So that leads me to think two things. One is that actually national implementation isn't just about what it says in the articles, but thinking much more broadly and helping states understand what they need, what the emerging challenges are for them, what are the actual needs that they have. And it brings me around to then thinking, well, what's our role in this? What role does civil society have in supporting, leading, shaping implementation? So there's a question about getting states and to do more, and as Richard points out, to increase funding. But there's also a question for us, I think, to look inside our own community and say, okay, there is a problem. What kind of research can we do which is problem-oriented, which is action-oriented, which can actually support and get involved with that kind of thing? And I don't think it's just a case of saying to states, what do you need? We'll do whatever you want. It's about taking a critical approach and trying to think ahead of the curve and sort of think of creative projects which can support these. And of course, we need money, as I said before, to do this kind of work. But clearly, by looking at the membership of the CWCC, the people who are involved, if we can even more so bring in more voices from underrepresented regions, then actually, I believe, we can bring in more capability, more capacity to actually provide useful, engaged work with the OPCW. And I'd be interested to hear people's opinion on that and what that might look like.
Our next question is just a general question about universality and what can be done to bring in the 4 remaining countries that are not states parties to the CWC, which are Egypt, Israel, North Korea, and South Sudan.
Firstly, the first thing is we need to be very positive in recognizing that actually the regime has done brilliantly well to get everybody else on board. We are, although it looks grim to have some key countries outside, there has been tremendous success in achieving the universality we have. But I think there is a real difficulty at this point of assuming there's one answer to universality at this point. I think we're dealing with 4 countries in 3 different geographical and political contexts. There isn't a simple one answer for everyone to encourage these countries to be on board. There are the obvious issues, of course, in relation to, stressing the benefits they have from, access to peaceful chemistry, the benefits they have from assistance and protection issues. But the difficulty is we are dealing with very, very sensitive geopolitical issues. I mean, the issues of the last month or so in the Middle East just highlights the complexity of the situations, the difficulties of how you deal with some of the issues that are dealt with under the CWC in regions where there is such political divergence and a very, very different sense of what constitutes security at a national as well as a personal level than in many other countries. I think it would be wonderful to get these countries on board, but I think for all of them, there is going to be a challenge. I don't think that means we shouldn't try and slow down on that. What we need to do, though, is to ensure that any of those efforts do not exacerbate any existing challenges in any of the regions, but also don't act as a sort of distraction where you could imagine raising it in certain contexts where then other people would come forwards to say, to discuss the local area. So, at the moment, if we were to stand on a public stage and to say things about, for example, the Egypt and Israel situation, I can imagine in a public forum, the issues under discussion, the questions being raised would be much more about recent events of the broader political nature. And that then is very challenging because it's hard to get our message across. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying. We just have to be very careful and, dare I say, delicate with it. Thank you.
Well said. So let's see. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So here is one about the how is the CWC tackling the potential risks of AI-assisted chemistry to suggest new uncontrolled candidate agents? So with ChatGPT, for example, coming up with things that are obviously not in the schedules.
I don't have much to say to that because I'm not entirely sure. I would assume that the main route in which information is collated, generated, provided for the sort of the political side of the OPCW to consider would be through the Scientific Advisory Board. And I think that if states, I think a good way of measuring it is if states are requesting the Director General to request the SAB to, do specific project work on AI. I'm not sure if that has happened at the minute. Of course, AI, I think, is cropped up in the most recent SAB report, but I think the way forward would probably be to have a sort of standing group or a sort of specific element of the SAB set up which deals with this as an emerging area. But I mean, beyond that, I'm not sure because I would imagine a lot of the actual work that goes on in terms of verification and so forth isn't designed at this point to look for AI or to integrate AI into its understandings.
Yes, maybe I could just add a few words on that. I mean, I think one of the great difficulties with this debate is everybody is focused on what they see as the negative side of AI, as sort of machine learning. And essentially, a lot of the time, that is simply pattern recognition. This suggestion of new toxic chemicals being easily designed by AI is essentially about machine learning of pattern recognition of what materials have been toxic in the past. And of course, that pattern recognition has tremendous potential for assisting in verification. One of the great challenges in looking at industry is working out where relatively small proportions of chemicals being moved around industry could be being diverted in order to misuse them. And it may well be that we will find there are AI tools that will help us with that. The second dual use aspect of AI, this whole AI thing, is that a lot of the reasons why some of the data sets are available that can tell people, provide people with information such as toxicity, are there for very, very good peaceful uses. So, for example, the most famous or probably the most famous of the stories about AI, about a company who decided, oh, what happens if we ask our system to generate the most toxic chemicals? They came up with lots of candidates. What people often lose from that story is that organization had an extensive database about human toxicity of compounds in order to help pharmaceutical companies generate medicines that would have a lower toxicity in the human body. And they just decided one day, well, what happens if we change the question we're asking that data set? So you couldn't ban that sort of data set. It's a question of how you control that data set so that the peaceful uses to get lower toxicity future pharmaceuticals out of that knowledge rather than people generating new compounds. And then the problem with the question about generating new compounds is, of course, you're not always overcoming any other barriers to things such as manufacture. I'm much less worried about somebody working out some new structure of a compound that might be as toxic as VX if they don't actually have the capacity to manufacture it. And we are a long way from the ability to make a lot of that much easier. So it's an area to look at. It's an area to be concerned about, but it's not an area to allow ourselves to get to get caught up in the overhyping. Thank you.
So it looks like we are almost out of time. We have a few questions that we unfortunately won't get to, but okay, we can, sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Yes, we can ask one more question quickly, which I have to go back to find very quickly. Okay. What are your specific suggestions for more engagements of civil society in the Technical Secretariat capacity building programs under Articles 10 and 11 of the CWC? So just for ease of reference for everyone, Articles 10 and 11 are assistance and protection against chemical weapons and economic and technological development. So if we can answer this in like 30 seconds to a minute, that would be great.
Yeah, the reason I kind of jumped in quickly because I saw that and I want to answer it in 10 seconds, which is I don't have any specific suggestions, even though I did say in my talk that we need to be doing more of this sort of thing. But my answer to that is actually that we should be having discussion about this, that actually civil society should be able to find ways to come together and say, what is available, what sort of projects can we run? And moreover, I think when you're thinking of something as broad as economic and technological development, which is important for people all over the world, then actually we need to have, it's not just for me to say or one person to say, it's actually to have different voices from different regions, sub-regions saying what could be useful and what could be done from their perspective. So to answer Shariar's question, yeah, I mean, open a discussion about it and let's see what we could sort of brainstorm in that regard. Thanks.
Yes, and I would answer in two parts. The first would be just what should be a civil society pressure on the TS in this area, and one of them, key to me, is longer term staff dealing with it. One of the issues of tenure policy is because you can only stay in post for 7 years, you start to look for other jobs long before that. And when you've got something like capacity building in a country, either for assistance and protection or for promoting peaceful uses of chemistry, it takes time for any TS staff to get to know that country and engage with that country and find the right people to engage with. And if you've got a staff rotation every 3 or 4 years of the people involved with that for specific countries, it's much harder. So the first thing is to increase the longevity and the sustainability. The second is that there are many civil society organizations that do have specific knowledge in certain areas where I think we are missing opportunities. So, for example, a number of development charities that deal with disaster relief, I think could be utilized for their training for how there is response to some of the public health aspects of an alleged use or an accident. That is very valuable. And there's also much, I think, that experienced educators that, aren't in government, aren't in the TES, can be used to help sensitize governments, regulators to issues around peaceful uses. There is we look at countries and think they're unified blocks of political process, but actually all the key decisions are taken by individual humans at a variety of levels of seniority. And one of the difficulties when you're trying to help a country improve its use of chemistry, whether through industry, whether through provision of new pharmaceuticals, whatever else, is a country without much capacity often hasn't got much regulatory challenge, hasn't got much regulatory capacity. And it is then very useful to try and use external educators to be able to bring people up about bring people up to speed about what is situations in, say, economically similar or geographically similar countries. And I think that sort of interaction could be very valuable, where the TS wouldn't have to build an in-house capacity, but sort of bring some in, possibly with external funding, in order to help that capacity building process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now just very quickly, we'll hear from Paul Walker, CWC Coalition Chair, and then we will be on our way. So.
Thanks, Mina, and thank you very much, Richard and Alexander, for very thoughtful comments of you both. I couldn't agree with you more on civil society, and you raised almost all the issues I think possible around the CSP 28. I would urge everyone to come to CSP 28. It's only 10 days away, so it's a little bit late if you don't have already plans to go. But as the CWC Coalition, we will have 3 side events, one on victims, one on riot control agents, both of which were mentioned in the discussion, and an open forum. And the open forum, I think, will be Thursday afternoon. We're still working with the OPSW on schedule, so stay tuned to a schedule which Mina will send out next week. We're also making joint NGO statements on about 10 different topics in plenary session. Remember, our first plenary opportunity was at RC3 in 2013. So it'll be, I think, a lively meeting. I think a lot of, particularly in what's going on in the world, will impact, no doubt, the session. And I urge you all to come. If you can't attend, the plenary sessions will be broadcast. So watch the plenary sessions if you like. And with that, thank you all for attending. We, as the coalition, we try to organize these things, about 6 online discussions, about every 4 to 6 weeks. This will be our last one until the CSP 28, and then we'll resume discussions in January again. So thank you all, and I'll turn it back to Mina.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Again, if you need to email me with any questions, please feel free. I put my email in the chat, but it's mrozei@armscontrol.org. And with that, we are done for today. So thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day.